and it's a pleasure to be online with you today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The Small Farms Network Capital Region Incorporated is a grassroots information service based near Canberra. The volunteer committee help organise events and programs specifically designed for small farmers. This event would not be possible without their hard work and support. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors, the National Landcare Program, and we've received some in-kind support from Elisabeth Larsen from Herds from Hire, and I thank them for their contribution. So I'd like to just let you know a little about what to expect tonight. Sandra will be giving us a PowerPoint presentation for about 40 minutes, and then Elisabeth will chat to me about her experience managing goats for weeds. There will be a question and answer session at the end. Please type your questions into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. When you do that, please select everyone so that when you send your message so that other people can see what you have asked. The chat box messages are saved. This webinar will be recorded and placed on the Small Farms Network Capital Region YouTube channel. Attendees cannot be seen in the recording. At the end of this webinar, I invite you to complete a survey that comes up when the Zoom session is finished. Your feedback helps us plan and deliver events like this one. So I just wanted to let you know that there's one topic that we won't have time to cover today, and that's really just because the goat topic is so large and we can't cover every single aspect to do with their management. And that is to do with goats and feral animal management. I'd just like to let you know that the Small Farms Network ran a series of webinars on feral animal control last year. And if you need help with that, you can find details on the Small Farms Network Capital Region website under projects. And at the end of this webinar, I'm going to give you links to the website so that you know how to find us, and I'll also put that in the chat function. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight, Dr Sandra Baxendell from Goat Vet Oz and Elisabeth Larsen from Herds for Hire. Sandra is a specialist goat vet based in Queensland. She has extensive formal qualifications and a Certificate 5 in training and assessment. Sandra did her PhD using goats and also completed her college membership exams in goats. She is accredited for the Market Assurance Program for Johne's disease and provides free education events about caprine arthritis encephalitis. Sandra is passionate about goat education and enjoys sharing her knowledge with farmers. Elisabeth Larsen has a Master's in Environmental Science and is an accredited Biodiversity Assessment Method Assessor in New South Wales. She is an ecologist practicing innovative solutions for big environmental problems, including using goats to manage weed infestations. So I'm just going to stop my share there, Sandra. Yep. And thanks for bearing with me while we work through those technical difficulties. I appreciate it. And ask you if you could share your screen, please. Yep.
Okay. So I'm talking about the options that small farms have for adding goats onto their properties. So there's many different types of goats and they're kept for many purposes. So if you're interested in dairy goats for household milk, one good option is to have 2 quality milking goats and make them alternate years, because Saanen goats in particular will easily milk for 2 years running. And if you leave the kids on at night, if you leave the kids on the does, and just lock them up at night and milk them in the morning. That means that you've got some flexibility. So if you want to go away for a weekend, the kid will take care of the milk and you're not tied to milking a goat twice a day. So that's a good option if you just want a couple of dairy goats for household milk production. Goats can also be kept for cashmere, and cashmere goats are actually shorn by farmers, and they're shorn standing up. So a chain is placed around the horns and the nose is placed in a little holder, and then they're shorn. So you don't have the problems of trying to find shearers, because most cashmere farmers shear their own goats. Angora goats, and remember that Angoras produce mohair. Angora, the fibre, actually comes from Angora rabbits. So don't talk to an Angora breeder about Angora, talk to them about mohair. So the best mohair prices come from home spinners, and it's also used by doll makers because they use the mohair as hair for dolls. There are other options for selling the mohair. There is a pool where people send in their mohair, and that's combined up into lots, and then those lots are sold to international buyers. So you don't have to be a large producer to sell your mohair. But one of the problems with mohair is that you do need to find good shearers. Unlike sheep, where there are wax glands near the udder, there's no wax glands in goats. It's one of the main differences between sheep and goats. So this means that the teats actually stand upright a little bit. So you have to have good shearers, otherwise they'll accidentally shear off the teats. Then you have meat goats. So there's a range of meat goat breeds. So you've got the Boers, which are the white goats with brown around the head. You've got red Boers, which are shown on the left-hand side there, and Kalahari red, which look very similar to the red Boers. And then you also have ferals, or what they call now rangeland goats, and they are a lot cheaper to buy, but they're obviously not as selected for meat and sometimes can be slightly less likely to be able to be handled. So meat taint is when you've got the male hormones of a male goat, and they actually, during the breeding season, the bucks smell quite revolting, and that could taint the meat. However, for export markets, they'll take bucks with no penalty. If you're using your goats for home consumption, you might like to think about castration, and that's can be done so long as you are doing this as soon as possible for the buck kids. However, I'd query about whether that's really needed, because bucks are seasonal breeders, and so they only smell during the breeding season, which is February, March till about July, so that outside those times they don't smell. So the Animal Welfare Code says that they should be banded as soon as possible. You can ask your vet for some meloxicam, either by injection or by an oral gel for pain relief. Now, pet goats should not be banded early. If you're keeping your wethers as pets, for example, with the miniature breeds, a lot of those goats are kept as pets. Ideally, you should not castrate those animals until they're over 2 months of age, because you want the maximum width of the urethra, especially in the little miniature breeds such as the Nigerian dwarf and the Pygmies. And that is because a lot of these pet goats, especially if they're not fed correctly, can develop urinary calculi. So you want to leave the male hormone to make the width of the urethra as wide as possible. Now, goats need shelter because they just don't have any lanolin in their coats, and so they're very susceptible to cold stress. They need to have yards with very short races because goats will pack up and jump one on top of the other, and the poor kid or goat that's on the bottom can actually be smothered. So keep the races very short, not like sheep races. You need to have fences that are very good. Ring lock fences are generally used, but you must make sure that the strainers are horizontal and not diagonal, because goats will just run up the diagonal strainers and jump over the fences. They're very intelligent and they can work that out very easily. You've got to have a yard and a method of catching and loading the goats. Sometimes goats will need to be loaded, take them to a meatworks or take them to a veterinarian. So you've got to have a small yard and you've got to have some method of loading the goats. Now, pet goats, especially the miniature breeds, can be put in the back of station wagons or cars with someone holding them. But generally they're put into trailers to transport, either to shows or to veterinarians. Now, a useful first aid kit. I was asked to cover this. So the most important thing is a digital thermometer. The normal temperature is quite high, it's 39.3 plus or minus 0.5. So basically anything that's over 40 degrees C is either heat stress or an infection. So you'll need syringes and needles, a 21 gauge 1/4 inch needle for subcutaneous injection, and a 19 gauge 1 inch needle for intramuscular injections works well in goats. You need a worm drench, but that worm drench must be one that you know works on your farm, on your goats. And we'll cover how to determine that in future slides. Some calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, glucose is quite useful, so that's just here. They make those packs for cows, so don't give the whole pack. They only need 80 to 100 mils. You'll need a drench gun and you'll need some good antiseptics such as hibitane or betadine, and some electrolytes are quite often useful, especially if the goat's scouring. Now, goats need vaccinations, and this is the recommended vaccine for goats. It's Glanvac 3, which protects goats for enterotoxemia, for tetanus, and for cheesy gland. Now, unlike sheep, where it says just vaccinate annually, they must be given a vaccine every 6 months. The dose is 1 ml under the skin. So, unfortunately, the smallest pack size is 250 mils. So I'd encourage you to work with your vet. Your vet can sell you individual doses of vaccine legally, or else you might like to go in with a neighbour and share a pack. Or possibly you might have a neighbour that's a sheep producer that might give you some doses. Now let's talk about ear tags. Now all sheep and goats, with a couple of exceptions which I'll go through, must have an NLIS tag. So that's National Livestock Identification Scheme. And this includes sheep and goats being moved to sale yards or abattoirs or shows, not to vets unless the vet is keeping them overnight. If you're going between properties, if you've got a couple of properties, they must be tagged before they're moved. If they're going onto a road or if they're going to live export. So you have pink and coloured tags. Now the white tags are for goats that are bred on your property, and the pink tags are for goats that are identified before movement. So these are post-breeder tags. So there are colours for years of birth, but that's only voluntary. You don't have to do that. And if you've got small numbers of goats, you don't have to worry about it. If you're vaccinating for Johne's disease with the Cashmere vaccine, they must also have a V tag in their ear to show that they're vaccinated. Now, which ear? Legally, it's any ear, but by tradition, if you like, females are generally tagged in the goat's left ear, but legally any ear. So how do you do it? So you wipe the skin with methylated spirits. You put the tagger between the ear creases. So there are blood vessels that go down in these creases. So if you choose an area between the creases, then you're not going to get bleeding. But make sure that the tag won't rub into the eyes. The exemptions for tagging: dairy goats, if they're registered with the Dairy Goat Society of Australia, they must be tattooed, and therefore they don't have to have an ear tag. And that's because a lot of those dairy goats, they're kept in close confinement, and other goats get the tags and rip them out. There is a breed of dairy goat called the La Mancha, and that actually doesn't have any ears, so you obviously can't tag them. The other one is if it's a registered goat depot where they're just capturing feral goats and they're selling them direct to an abattoir, so that they don't have to be tagged because they're going straight from capture to an abattoir, and obviously in an emergency. Now, if you're buying goats or if you're buying any livestock, you should get a health declaration. These are available from the Farm Biosecurity website, and you should get that well before you go and look at the goats, because you don't want to go there, fall in love with a goat, and then find out that they've got some problems and their health declaration is less than desirable. So you'll notice some diseases here: Johne's disease, foot rot, which of course is common in sheep as well, and a goat-specific disease, caprine arthritis and cephalitis. So we'll have a look at those. So this poor goat here on the left is a boar goat that's got CAE. You'll notice that it's got enlarged knees and some of the other joints are enlarged, and there's also wasting. That goat's not in very good condition. So they're all the clinical signs of caprine arthritis and cephalitis. It's caused by a virus. There is no treatment. And then we've got Johne's disease. Whoops. So a goat with Johne's disease is very skinny. Sometimes they scour in the terminal stages, but quite often there's no scouring, which is a feature of Johne's disease in sheep and cattle. But in goats, they just look like a skinny goat. So they're easily missed, unfortunately. The other thing you must do if you're getting a new goat is that you must do a strategic drench. You must do a quarantine drench to make sure that any goat you buy, you want to buy the goat, but you don't want to buy the worms, especially if those worms have drench resistance in them. Now, there's two types of drenches. One strategic, which includes the quarantine drench that you use when you get a new goat in. And there's also strategic drenches at certain times of the year or life cycle. So the first summer drench, which is in late spring or early summer, that prevents the build-up of goat worms. Also, you should do a weaning drench. So when kids are weaned from their mothers and moved, they should get a drench that you know works. So how do you know which worms you've got and how many worms you have? And you do that by collecting fecal samples and getting those fecal samples examined and getting worm egg counts done. Now, there are providers. So if you go to the WormBoss website, which is www.wormboss.com.au, and you go to service providers, you'll see a list of certified worm egg count providers for your state. So just have a look at that list, and that's where you send them off. Now, you can post them. You don't have to have them delivered. So you should be collecting the feces. You can do bulk tests or individual tests. Individual tests are obviously better. So these are the the providers of worm egg counting services. Okay, so there's a wide range of them, and you might have one that's reasonably close to you. Okay. Then you have to, once you've got your results back, the results come back, they might be 1,200 eggs per gram, or they might only be a couple of hundred eggs per gram. So what do you do with that result? You look at the Drench decision guide for your region, and that will tell you what you need to do. So here is one for the New South Wales, Central, Southern and Southwest. So that's generally your area. And that will tell you whether you should drench or not. Obviously, the more times you drench, the more likely you are to have developed drench resistance in your worm population. So you want to keep drenches to only those times that you really need them. It's also critical to know if you've got the barber's pole worm or not. Now, not all farms will have it in your areas. If you do, it changes situations. Most of the country around in New South Wales and Victoria have Trichostrongylus worms, which cause scouring, but your barber's pole worm or Homunculus contortus causes anemia. They actually suck blood, and they're called barber's pole because you can see the blood that they're lapping up, and they are all throughout the gut. So you can actually see barber's pole worm in the fourth stomach, but you can't see Trichostrongylus in the intestines. Now, goats need higher dose rates for all the drenches. Goats evolved in the Middle East, and they evolved in a situation where they are browsing over large areas. So they put their evolutionary effort into coping with tannins in the browse and not in developing a gut immunity, such as happens with adult cattle and adult sheep. So this means they have very efficient livers to cope with the tannins and the other poisons in the browse, but that means that they metabolize all drugs much more quickly. So for each of the different classes of drugs, you'll see here the sheep dose rate is down here, and the goat dose rate is much higher than the sheep dose rate. So vets must write you a prescription. And the other thing is that vets can legally sell you small amounts of drench. Now, a lot of the drenches will come in 5 litres minimum. Some drenches, such as Q drench, come in 1 litre. But even 1 litre, if you've got a small amount of drench, costs a lot of money, and also it's likely to get expired. before you use it all up. So it's worthwhile talking to your vet about getting small amounts of the drench with the veterinary prescription that you need. So there are random property identification codes, or PICs. And if you've got livestock, you must have a PIC. And you get that just by phoning your local land services vet or department, and they will arrange for you to have a PIC, which gets printed on your ear tags. So random PICs are chosen and they're audited, and they choose a certain number every year, and you then are subject to an audit. And it doesn't matter if you've only got 2 or 3 goats, if you've got a PIC, you can be chosen for audit. And one of the things they look for is that you've used, you must have a record of all treatments that you've given. And that means for goats, because most of the drenches are off-label, you must have a veterinary prescription. And this is one of the reasons why, because unfortunately, export meat samples have been found to have residues. So here are the National Residue Survey results, and you'll see here that some of the worm drenches have been identified in the meat samples, and that puts our export markets at risk. So you don't want to be the goat producer that has sold goats with residues of worm drenches. The other thing to remember is if the worm drench is not registered for goats, there should be none detected. And moxidectin and closantel are not registered for goats. So strictly speaking, it must be below the level of detection. And seeing as labs can test down to parts per billion, that's very difficult to do. Now, there's been a lot of research done in trying to prevent drench-resistant worms. Initially, when I graduated, we were told to change the family of worm drench every year. That didn't work. That just developed resistance to both at the same rate. Then we're told swap every 5 years. Then we were told use one drench until it no longer worked and then use another. However, we now know that you should be using combination drenches. So if a worm has got to get a mutation to 2 or 3 drenches at the same time in order to survive, that's much less likely to happen. There are 5 drench families. So we've got the benzimidazoles, which are the white drenches, levamisole, which are the clear drenches. You've got the macrocytic lactones, which are humectins. Then you've got monopantal, which is Zolvex, and you've got the new one, which is Startec. And then you've got the combination drenches. Unfortunately, no combination drench is registered for goats. Then you have the narrow drenches, such as ramitin, which is an organophosphate, which I do not recommend for goats, it's too toxic. And you've got closantel, which only kills Barber's poleworms. Then you have the narrow spectrum drenches, such as triclobendazole, which kills liver fluke, and praziquantel, which kills tapeworms. But you do have to be very careful. So Startec has a 14-day withholding period for meat, for sheep, but for goats, because you're giving it at a higher dose rate, most vets will increase that number of days for Startec. For Zolvex, unfortunately, even for sheep, the export slaughter interval is 10 weeks. And also bear in mind that some of these drenches can eat through plastic containers, so don't save small amounts. Use a glass jar if you're sharing some drench. So don't go by the names of the brands, go by the names of the active families. For example, if you're doing a quarantine drench, and the recommendation is you use a number of different worm drench families if you're getting new animals in. If you use Zolvex Plus, Drench and Startec, you're actually giving the drug abamectin 3 times, because Zolvix Plus has abamectin, Drench has abamectin, and Startec has abamectin. So don't use brand names. Also, you should try and just do those goats which need it, based on their eye colour, if you've got barber's pole worms, their body condition, whether they're scouring or not, and if they've got a coat appearance, or if they've got bottle jaw, which is swelling underneath the jaw. But ideally, you'd be using fecal egg counts to identify that before these goats got this bad. So it's very important that you don't buy in somebody else's drench-resistant worms or diseases. So have very close questioning of the people you're going to buy your goats from. The other thing is goats eat from the top down, which is good for worm control if you can leave your pastures high, but it also means that they become more mineral deficient because they're not eating soil. When sheep are grazing paddocks, they quite often will eat clover burrs in the soil and pick up soil. So mineral deficiencies are much more likely in goats than in sheep. And you can see here this very bad case of goiter in this boar kid, which is born dead. Also notice a lack of hair coat. So the thyroid gland is massively enlarged. That's a normal thyroid gland on the right. So ask your local vet or local land services what mineral deficiencies are present in your district so that you know what supplements are needed. Now, goats can control weeds by eating flowers and seed pods, by preferentially eating weeds so they can't compete with pasture, and ring-barking weeds so they eventually die off. So these are some of the weeds that we know that goats can control, and blackberries and briar, which I know are an issue in your area, are quite often relished by goats. And thistles. Goats love to eat thistles, especially the flowers of thistles. So they get very good at controlling those. So here are some of the energy and crude protein levels of some of the weeds that are eaten by goats. So thistles are quite high in energy and crude protein. The briar rose, that is not quite as good as energy, but much higher in protein. And blackberry again, if they're eating the leaves, the young leaves and the young stems, they're 10.6 megajoules and 21% protein. So that's excellent feed. So the advantages of using goats, there's no machinery is needed, no chemical cost. They can do weed control on steep ground and near watercourses. Goats dislike clover, so clover will spread, which is good for sheep and cattle. They can control woody growth from the neighbours, and they love the flowers and seeds. There's no chemical residue issues. They can prune the lower branches of tall forestry trees, and they turn the weeds into good feed and goat meat, goat fibre. So if you need more information, there's my contact details. And we're just about on the 40 minutes. So I'll hand back to you, Alex.
Okay, Sandra, I think what we may do, if you can just stop your share, please, is I think I'll throw to you now for some of the questions because they're all relating to you, and then if any more pop up towards the end, we can address them then. Is that okay for you?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So the first one is, could you please make recommendations as to what can be used on the ground in a sacrificial zone in wet years to ensure goats hooves stay healthy? How easy is it to keep Oh, there's another question. So we'll address that one first. So talk to us about goat hooves.
I love the photo behind you, Alex. Those rocks, they're really great, and they would be perfect for keeping goats' hooves controlled.
Yeah.
So if you could get some of those rocks, goats love to jump on them and play King of the Castle on them. So if you've got some rocky areas there, that's ideal.
Yeah, okay.
There's nothing much else you can do. I mean, you could have gravel in the laneways, but, you know, if you've got some natural rocky areas, that's ideal.
Yeah, okay. And Elisabeth, can you hear me as well?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great. We've got you. Perfect. So I guess I had the advantage of seeing you at the Botanic Gardens on Wednesday, and so I'll just invite you in now to perhaps make a comment on that as well, because you were showing us a few things with the goats' hooves. Could you have a little chat about that?
Just please repeat the question again.
How can we look after the goats' hooves to stay healthy,
Yes.
particularly in wet years like this?
Yes, goat hooves need to be looked after, particularly in wet seasons, because many of the goats on farms aren't really on hard surfaces. A lot of goats are on soft surfaces, and then naturally, historically, would be developed in countries that had a lot of rocks, so they're climbing mountains. If they don't have that, they're like a horse. The hoof will grow and won't naturally be worn down, so you have to check the hoofs regularly. I do it maybe 3 or 4 times a year when I use a little shear and I lift up every single hoof and I trim it so that it looks quite nice and neat. Also, you have to watch them a little bit, particularly when it's wet, because they can develop what I think is called interdigital dermatitis, which is a bacteria that grow between the hoof pads because it's not dry enough for it to dry out. And I'm sure Sandra could explain a little bit more about that. But what we do is that we dip their feet in a zinc sulfate solution. So we use 1/10 of zinc sulfate that we get from our local agricultural store. It's mixed with water, and we dip their feet. We run them through a little race and leave them in the foot bath for a minimum of 5 minutes. I'm sure Sandra could expand on that one. But we do that. Yeah, sort of on a needs basis. I do, but I know many goat farmers do it quite regularly, maybe even every second day or so. Maybe Sandra can say a bit more about that.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Elisabeth. So I might just give you a little bit of feedback. Your computer is moving a little bit. I don't know whether you could stabilise it a little bit as I'm having a chat to Sandra. It just might be a little bit off-putting it, but if it's not
the table rather than computer.
Okay, all right. That's all right. We'll keep going. It's no worries. Okay, Sandra. How easy is it to keep goats producing milk without a kid?
Without a kid?
Without a kid. So can you keep them producing if you don't have a kid?
Oh, yeah. Well, obviously, if they have to kid once, and then you might sell that kid or whatever. But depending on the quality of the genetics, it's quite common for these goats to milk for 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
Without having to go into kid again. And
right.
in New Zealand, for example, and in the UK, they quite often do that because kidding is very labour intensive. And also there's animal welfare concerns about what you do with the excess males. So they generally keep them milking for 2 years or more.
Okay.
And they produce well,
Right.
especially the Saanen breeds.
Okay, so that leads on to the next question about what goats are best for dairy, please.
Yeah, Australia has world-class Saanens, but it's really a personal preference.
Yeah.
So go to a goat show with dairy goats, have a look at the breeds and decide what you want.
Okay. And this is a question here, is the 5-in-1 vaccine okay if the vet only sells 5-in-1 single doses?
Yeah. In that case, I'd be vaccinating 4 times a year, because research in the UK showed that if you're using multiple vaccines, then you've got less protection against enterotoxemia, and you also have no protection at all against cheesy gland, because your 5-in-1 doesn't cover cheesy gland. It only covers the clostridial diseases.
Okay, so can you get the cheesy gland as a separate, or?
No, it's Glandvac, either 3 or Glandvac 6, which does come in a smaller volume.
Okay.
Is the only ones that will cover you for cheesy gland.
Okay.
But anyone can buy it. It's not restricted as dog and cat vaccines are. It's just that you have to buy 250 mils of Glandvac 3. Rather, and then you've got, you know, it does cost, I forget what it costs, something about $120, something like that, for enough doses to do 250 sheep or 250 goats.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a bit of it is a problem for smaller producers, for sure. So there's another question here that says, do elf-eared miniature goats need to be tagged?
If they don't have any ears, they are exempt. So that includes all the breeds. So that's La Manches and the elf-eared goats.
Okay. What happens with them then? Do they just able to move without?
Now, in some commercial dairies with La Manches, they actually tag the tails.
Right.
So, yep.
Okay.
But at the moment, the government regulations just give an exemption.
Right. Okay.
Because you can't tag an ear if there is none.
Okay. So there's a question here about nihilist tags. Not a question, but a comment, just saying that the females are always right and the males are left. And
maybe it's different in different states, but
yeah,
it's legally you can use any year.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and just that the nihilist tags and some management tags are recommended in the opposing ear so that the earmark is not obscured by the tag. Yeah, okay. If goats are not going to be moved to any other property or to any show, but they're going to stay permanently on the property where they were born, do they need to be tagged?
No.
Okay. How do certified organic owners deal with worms?
Okay, there are a couple of options. One is if you've got homunculus, you can use copper oxide wire particles, which are okay. You can use specific pastures which have high tannin contents, things like chicory. And you can also use Biowoma, which is a naturally occurring fungus, which you feed large amounts of the fungal spores. They go through the goat. The goat has the fungal spores in the manure. They hatch out, they lasso the larvae in the manure and eat them. And research has shown they will eat 86% of the worm larvae in the manure. So if you continuously feed it, then you'll be continuously breaking that cycle, because the worm larvae are going to be destroyed by the fungus.
Okay. Is black nightshade toxic to goats, or can they eat it?
Yes, it is toxic in large amounts. Yep.
And we've just got a few comments there just saying that goats are fantastic for gorse control, and that Josephine is using them for that at the moment, and they're regenerating the soil as they go. So thank you for that comment. Will goats avoid plants that are poisonous to them? We've got hemlock on the property.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. There's one there about ring barking trees. And jump in, Elisabeth, if you've got a comment on this. I've heard that goats will ring bark trees.
Yep.
What are the ways to avoid this? Is that your experience?
Yes, they will. They could be pretty rough on trees in general. They are not as bad on eucalyptus trees, I find, where we live. They tend to be a bit gentler on those, but most other bark is gnawed off, particularly on acacia wattle trees, to get a bit rough treatment. Ways to avoid it. That's a hard one. I've tried all kinds of things to avoid it. I've had some success with just using some netting around the trees, where I want the goats to not gnaw on them. But I never leave my goats long enough in a pen so that becomes an issue for me. And also I use this special portable netting to contain my goats with. So I tend to set my fence up so that I avoid those trees and plants that I don't want to impact on. But because often my clients' objective is to, reduce fire hazards or attack a woody weed, we are happy to see the ring barking. That's what we often want.
Yeah.
But that's a hard one. It's you can tell a goat to eat that, but not that, but it's not going to listen to you. And also, if you are confining a herd of goats within the fence, when they get hungry, they will eat anything, really, even stuff that's toxic to them. And you've got to be very careful with that, because it can have some awful consequences. So I always check, wherever I go, I always go first and make sure that everything is safe for the goats to eat. Yeah. You will notice that they generally avoid things that are toxic because it has some kind of taste, I don't know. But in an artificial situation where they are confined and they don't really have a choice, they will eat it. Yeah.
Okay.
That's my experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Is ivermectin, I guess this is for you, Sandra, a good drench for goats?
There is no drench that's guaranteed to kill worms on every farm in every goat. So what you've got to do is drench the goats with whatever drench you've got, and then 14 days later, you repeat the worm egg counts. Now, it has to be 14 days, because if it's any sooner, sometimes the worms just get sick, so they don't reproduce. If it's any later than 14 days, the life cycle of homuncus is only 17 days. So the worm eggs that you see might be from worms that they got from eating larvae the day after they were drenched. So the only way to know if that drench works on your farm is to do what's called a drench check, and highly recommend www.wormboss.com.au, and that explains how to do a drench check. And you should be doing that at least every time you get to the bottom of your drench container. Before you buy another drench container, you should check it works, because if it doesn't work, you're just wasting your money and increasing drench resistance.
Right. Okay. There's a question here about, I have wild water birds like bin chickens visiting my property. Could they spread disease to my goats and alpacas?
They can have salmonella, they can have E. coli, unlikely that that would spread them to the goats and alpacas. So as long as your water is clean, I wouldn't worry too much about birds.
Okay. All right. Could you provide a recommendation in terms of the best feed options to reduce calculi, given feed is limited in some areas due to flooding?
So for urinary calculi, the recommendations is that you feed no more than half lucerne, and you should have half oat and hay or something similar, or you feed a grassy lucerne, because you don't want too much calcium in the diet. You also don't want too much phosphorus from grain, so you have to very restrict the amount of grain that's given to male goats. Okay, so obviously if they're in poor conditions, such as a buck in the breeding season or a kid that's just been weaned, they must get some grain, but you don't want to give too much.
Okay. So just a clarification from Tony, it's my understanding that goat depots for rangeland goats must tag goats if retaining them for greater than 10 days.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
But if they're sending them straight to slaughter after they collected enough for a truckload, then they can go without tagging.
Yeah. Now, there's just a comment that Glenvac is almost impossible to get in some areas. I guess that's...
It's all, I can always buy it from my veterinary wholesaler. So it is available. So you just have to get them to order it in for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you use a 6-in-1 for goats?
6-in-1, well, again, the multiple vaccines are not as effective in goats. They also cause larger lumps. So it's not ideal. The ideal is Glanvac 3, because goats don't really get black disease. They don't get gas gangrene. The recommendation from Zoetis is use Glanvac 3 unless you've got confirmed cases of the other clostridial diseases in goats on your property.
Okay.
So that's the recommendation.
Okay. So I'm just going to ask you one more question, Sandra, and then I'm going to invite Elisabeth to tell us a little bit about what she does, because there are quite a few messages there. Are there any short courses that you would recommend for people to learn about breeding goats?
Breeding goats?
Yeah.
Not quite sure. Every year I do a kidding course for people to prepare for kidding. I do that via Zoom, but I'm not sure about breeding and what they mean by breeding.
Okay. So I guess I can just let people know that the Tocal Agricultural College produces ag guides, and that may be a help. So if after this webinar, I will put up a summary, and if I can address some of that and maybe include some of those resources, which will be published on our website. So Elisabeth, would you like to tell us a little bit about what you do? And I did take a few photos the other day, so I can pop them up, or we can just have a chat. So yeah, would you like to just tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yes, I can do that.
Yep.
Yes, so I live on the far south coast of New South Wales in the Bega Valley, where I work as an ecologist. And my husband, Jim, he is American citizen, and he had a friend in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest of the United States who told him about this amazing goat herd that had removed a severe blackberry infestation on the campus of the Washington State University. And we thought, well, Jim did, that if they can use goats to remove the blackberry, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, where there are 4 seasons and mostly rains 6 months of the year, why can't we do it here in Australia? So what we did, this is 11 years ago now, we flew Tammy Dunikin, the owner of the business who did that job in Seattle, over to the Bega Valley, and she showed us what she does and how she operates her business as a goat rental business, and that's what we've been doing since then. We don't have our own farm. We use a friend's farm to keep the goats between jobs. But what we do mostly during the summer, spring, and autumn season is to bring the herd, which is now 30 goats, to people's properties to remove mostly woody weeds. And in particular in the Bega Valley, we focus a lot on blackberry. And at the moment, we am speaking to you from Canberra, where our herd is doing a job for the Botanic Gardens. And that's a typical job. It's a gully full of weeds. It's blackberry, broadleaf privet, small leaf privet, a lot of vines, which the garden staff have sort of given up on, and they hadn't really been in there for years, but because I just couldn't, and it was sort of a problem that they didn't have any solution to, but the goats are doing a fabulous job for them. That's one job that we've been doing. Another job that we've been doing for years now is to remove blackberry along the foreshore of Lake Burley Griffin. Again, it was really hard for people and machinery to get to it. It was so close to the shore, and so the goats have been really useful there. There's a lot of interest in fire hazard reduction at the moment. I only have a herd of 30, so my operation is sort of a boutique type operation. We really mostly work on relatively small areas, up to 1-2 hectares maybe. So I can do that with a herd of 30, but if we're going to do really large job and remove fire hazard and stuff, we would have needed a much larger herd. That would be a different type of operation that I do. So yes, so we get a lot of inquiries from people that want just do weed control in their backyard, and we want get inquiries from large organizations, public agencies, private developers who want us to do larger jobs. So and it is growing. It's a growing industry. I'm laughing when I say that, because when we started out, we didn't even know if there was a market for it.
Yeah,
there certainly is a lot of interest in that solution now.
Okay.
And I don't need to tell you why it's such a good thing, because Sandra just listed a number of reasons of why you would want to use goats for that purpose. But I can add maybe that if you do it properly, they will leave you with a nice thick layer of mulch. It's really good for the soil. They don't spread weed seeds very much because of their very efficient metabolism. They break down a great majority of the seeds. And of course, the layer of mulch that they leave is good for water retention. And you don't have any soil compaction issues. The challenge you have is the containment issue. You're going to have to be very, very good with fencing. So that's the management part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I did take a photo the other day of the fencing. Would you like me to pop that up and perhaps just have a chat about that? Would that be okay for you?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So there's your goats, and there's the fence and the botanic gardens.
Yes, so you will see the fencing on the left-hand side. That is the fence that I use. It is an American-made fence, but it is sold through an Australian agent. The name of that business is, the agent is Chicken Caravan. That's because the American brand of fencing called Premier One also sells chicken fencing, which is really popular in Australia. But they also, Premier One also produces these fences, which is designed for sheep and goats. So it's an American-made fence. There are other options. There's some, in the most agricultural co-ops and feed stores, you will find some kind of portable fencing like that. But I've tried a few different ones, and I really prefer that one there. Yeah.
And that's just a photo on the right there of the gully, one of the gullies that you've been working on at the Botanic Gardens.
Yes, I think we'll be in a few. Oh yeah, I remember now. That's an after photo.
Yeah.
Wish you had the before photo too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it was an insanely densely vegetated gully, that one.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just look at sites and I'm thinking, there's no way how the girls are going to do this. Well, that'll be interesting to see, but they never ever let me down. They just, get into it. And yeah, so in that gully, I think we spent about a week in that gully. It was about an acre, 2/3 of an acre, and I had 26 goats in that area for a week. And then we walked them through the Botanic Garden, and that's also what could go wrong when we walk past the threatened species nursery. But because I've spent so much time with these animals, they are just remarkable. It looks like a Greek grandmother with her goats behind her. We're just a team, so it's amazing.
So one of the questions that we talked about on Wednesday was about the toxicity of weeds and the management of nutrition when they're grazing on weeds. And you touched on it a little bit before, but
yes.
Yeah.
I don't have all of that very technical knowledge that Sandra has, so I've had to learn all about this with just literature that I've found, and I always have a good relationship with the local vet. So I do have to do a bit of research, and I always make sure that the places that we go to have no toxic plants. And I just say no. If there are plants that I don't recognize and I'm unsure of, we just don't go.
Right.
Simple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what I've also learned, because there's so many toxic plants in pasture everywhere. I mean, in the Biga Valley, we have particularly prevalent is the fireweed, for instance, and we know it has toxicity in it. But what I try to do is to always make sure that they have a great variety of plants and browse to feed on. If they're on just a monoculture of plants for a long period of time, you're asking for trouble. But if you provide with a good wide variety of food, browse in particular, I've had no problems with toxicity as long as we've been doing this.
Right. Okay.
Our approach. They really need browse, and I think that's important to stress that, because if I've read some articles that say in a natural environment that probably will eat about 30% of grass and forbs and 70% of browse. So we're talking woody plant stems and shoots and flowers and berries and that kind of stuff. So that's very important for the health of the animals, that they have access to browse.
Right. Okay. And there is you've got a with the goats a little supplement block there.
Yeah, I always bring that along. It's a mineral block. We just always have that with us.
Yeah.
It's a precautionary thing.
Yeah. Okay. So one other thing was that was really clear when we visited the goats was how like they were trained to do the job that you're wanting them to do. So the question was, how do you select and train the goats for weed management?
Yes. All right. So I buy my animals from a breeder that I have known for a long time. She knows my operation. She knows what kind of animal would work for me. And that, quite simply, is a calm, gentle, handleable goat that is used to being around humans, and there's no anxiety or stress associated with being around me. Having said that, most goats come around and get used to people, but it takes a bit of time. But when I get my goats, I make sure that they know what an electric fence is. So my breeder, she has electric fencing. So I get my animals when they're about 1.5 years old, and they already know about electric fencing. And I make sure they are calm around my electric fencing, and I make sure to train them in the sense that I make sure that they touch my fence at least a couple of times so they know what it is. And the voltage is very low, it's just a little sting. But most of the animals that I would keep clearly understand that, and I wouldn't bring an animal with me to do the job that I'm doing unless I see that animal understands what an electric fence is.
Okay.
So that's how I do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll keep going through the questions from our audience then, unless there was something else that sort of really resonates with you that you'd like the audience to know about. Is there anything that you'd like to share with us that you would, that you feel is important that you'd like to share with us?
Yes. Don't underestimate the intelligence of a goat.
Yeah.
Yeah. They are on top of it. They really, if you do something twice, they will expect it a third time. They are super smart as a cattle dog, is my experience. Mm-hmm. So you have to be smarter than a goat, and that's not always easy. So you sort of have to pretend that you're one to anticipate what can go wrong.
Yeah. Okay.
That sounds maybe a bit esoteric, but it is so true. Yeah. And one morning I get to work and there's 2 little goats outside of my pen, and I have no idea how they got out. And then I realized there is a little drainage pipe that was yesterday covered with blackberry, but today it's, they've removed the blackberry, so they managed to find their way out. So you only have to mistake once.
Yes.
Yeah. And yes, I saw there was a question about wethers. Well, I use wethers, which are the D-sex males mostly. There's nothing wrong with the females at all, but it's the fact is, where I live, the wethers are available because I use the boar goat, which is a meat-bred animal, and they sell the young males for slaughter. So instead, I buy them. I find, and Sandra, you mightn't, don't know if you agree with me about this, but I often find that females are amazing, but they are much more independent thinkers, in my experience, and they often second guess my decision making. So I just have to convince the older females to do what I want them to do, whereas the wethers seem to be a bit more easygoing creatures. But that could also only be an individual thing, but that's my experience. But I have maybe 90% wethers in my herd.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Beautiful. Sandra, I'm just going to throw a question to you that Yvonne sent in before the webinar, and it's relating to worm counts. If goats have high worm counts and they're moved from a wormy pasture into a yard on full feed or to a clean pasture and moved every few days, within 7 days, does this clean out their worms altogether? And how long would that take?
Yeah, so you'd have to wait until the worms died of old age. So for Homunculus contortus, the barber's pole worm, that's going to take 70 to 90 days. Liver fluke can last years. So, but for most worms, it's around that 70 to 90 days if you put them into a feedlot situation.
Yeah. So it is, you need to research a little bit on how long to spell your pastures for and
so on that Worm Boss website,
yeah,
you actually have graphs where you look at the temperature and they will tell you how long the worm larvae will last on pastures.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to now just work through some of the questions from the audience from tonight, and we'll just see how far we can go in the next 15 minutes or so. I'm not sure what this relates to, Sandra, but are mushroom spores expensive to feed continually? Is that what's in the Biowoma?
Yeah, they're not mushroom spores, they're spores of a particular fungus. It is expensive because it depends if you're using the liver mold with Biowoma or the pure Biowoma. So you have to feed it every day because it kills the larvae in the manure. But when you look at the price of worm drenches, it works out quite cheap. Now, I did notice there was a question that someone put up saying, is it available again? And yes, it is.
Right.
So both the liver mold with Biowoma and the pure Biowoma is available. Okay.
So there's a specific question about bracken fern toxicity and young goats. I don't know if you can specifically answer that, but possibly could you just address the issue of like the ages and stages of production or in goats that makes that they could be more susceptible to poisoning?
Yeah. So the younger goats would be more susceptible because they're lower body weight, so they would therefore need less of the toxin to have the clinical effects. Now, I noticed that Bear & Squires put a good website up, thanks Bear, for people to have a look at. I've also got Pinterest boards on poisonous plants that are dangerous to goats, and I've got one on browse that's safe to feed for goats. So they can look at my Pinterest boards and they'll answer a lot of their questions.
Okay, and I'll just add to that, Sandra, we did a webinar with, not a webinar, but we did a workshop with our local land services vet, Lou Baskind, in 2019, and we also had some information from Lou about toxicity of weeds and that sort of thing as well that might help people. Is copper sulfate as good as zinc sulfate for foot soaking?
It is, but it's more toxic to the environment. So people use zinc sulfate in preference because you have to dispose of the copper sulfate once it's been used for the foot baths, and it's more toxic to the environment. And also potentially if you're going to put it on pastures, it's toxic to the goats too, because goats can die of chronic copper toxicity if they eat pastures that are contaminated with copper.
Yeah. Is fireweed toxic to goats? Mine don't eat it, but they have plenty of other feed.
Fireweed it's called fireweed for different species. So unless you've got a scientific name, and I can look it up in the textbook, it's difficult, because some goats can eat what's called fireweed in South East Queensland, but they can't for those called fireweed in northern New South Wales.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you need to know what you've got.
So you need to press some samples of the plant with the flowers and send it off to the herbarian to get a scientific name.
Yeah. Where do you get the Biowoma from?
Well, I sell the pure Biowoma, but produce merchants stock the livermole with Biowoma. So you just have to ring around. The manufacturer has a website, which is www.biowoma.com. So you can ask them who's your local stockist. The pure Biowoma is only sold by vets.
Yeah. So there's I think this is a little bit too specific, and I guess we can't address every single question about a particular issue, but what would your advice be about pygmy goats, like drenching pygmy goats? Would they need to get specific veterinary advice and be weighing animals and things like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you need to weigh your goats. You don't want to overdose them, especially because you're using higher dose rates. So you don't want to overdose them, particularly with things that contain levamisole, because the toxic dose is about 2 times, and you have to give it at 1.5 times. So you must make sure that the dose rates are correct, and that's why you get a prescription from your vet for each of the worm drenches.
Yeah.
Because if you under drench, you're going to get drench resistance, and if you over drench, then you can get toxicity.
Yeah. Can you, Elisabeth, have you had any experience grazing lantana?
Not very much, because there's not a lot of lantana.
Yes, okay.
As well, so there is an area in Tilba where they have some lantana. I think there was a market garden there historically, and they brought it in for windbreaks or something. But so there's some. I get a lot of questions about that, and I think it's very hard to answer it, because it seems to be that the toxicity in lantana varies quite a bit.
Yep.
There's a lot of different varieties of lantana, and I've heard, and this is anecdotal, I cannot support it with any scientific evidence, but my understanding is that toxicity increases the further north you go, and it's more toxic in the tropical north, in the subtropical New South Wales, than it is on the far south coast. And the color of the flower can indicate something about the toxicity. But I advise anybody who has lantana on the property to check with local vets and just make sure what the situation is locally. But having said that, when we have had some lantana on jobs, the goats have had very little lantana, but they have not avoided eating it, and they haven't seen any health effects either.
Okay.
But again, I would never put a goats only on lantana. There could be a few plants of lantana, but 80–90% of other plants.
Right. Okay. So I guess this is the question to both of you. How do you manage the biosecurity of goats when you're moving them to multiple sites?
Yeah. So I live in the state of New South Wales, and the rules are really, really clear. You have to make sure that the property that you move your goats to has a property identification code. And whenever you move your goats from one property to another, you have to fill out a form that you bring with you. It says livestock movement forms that you can get from local land services. and you have to report the movements to the government. It's an online facility. And that seems to be working pretty well. We had a major challenge when we came from New South Wales and wanted to work for the federal government in Canberra, the National Capital Authority. The whole government of Australia actually came to a complete halt, trying to figure out how to get my goats across the border and let them work on site for the federal government in Canberra. But that has also been solved. Okay. So it is. We probably were the pioneers there. So yes, it's possible. But you just have to make sure you follow all those rules with reporting and property identification codes. So when I'm going to do a job for somebody, I make sure that they get their own property identification code before I go to their property.
Right. Okay. And are you doing anything in terms of your management of the goats in terms for biosecurity, like foot bathing or anything else managerial wise?
Not really, and that's because I don't travel that far. We have, a limit of how far we usually go. Yeah. We most of our work is in the Bega Valley and in the ACT. Our goats are regularly drenched. We follow the rules, like Sandra described. They are vaccinated, and we are on top of other health issues. Another thing is that we do most of our jobs in places where there haven't been any livestock before we got there, and there is not going to be any livestock on that site after we leave. Yeah. So we're not bringing in a pathogen into a herd. Yeah. So in the National Botanic Garden, well, then there are some native animals there. I have some kangaroos, but no, I don't really see that an issue for us. But it's certainly something that you have to be aware of when you move livestock around the place. Okay. Sure.
Have you had any experience with goats eating native Sifton bush?
No, I have no data. I've never been on Sifton bush, so I couldn't give you a reply to that one.
Okay. Yeah. So there's just there's a few comments that I think you've addressed after the message was written, so I'm not going to read them out. I think that you've addressed them when we're having our conversation. But do you need to whippy snip the area that the fencing is going on so that it's more effective, or how do you manage that sort of scenario?
Yes, you do that. You have to clear a path for the fencing. Doesn't have to be very wide, maybe half a meter or so. And I usually use a whippersnipper with that Australian invention called weed whacker on it. I'm Norwegian, I have no idea how to pronounce it, but it is really good. So I also need I use an electric chainsaw as well. But you don't want timber or wood to touch the fence, or metal, of course. So I do have to clear a path. So there's a little bit of work involved.
Yeah. And so in the actual area where the goats are working, like, do you, how do you get them access to some of the weeds? Do you have to lay?
In that sense. Oh, yeah. Yes, I'm going to have to say I'm part of the herd. I really am, because sometimes the blackberry bushes are so tall that the goats really can't reach it. I mean, I have been to places with blackberry that is 2-3 meters tall. So I'm part of the job, and that might mean that I have to crush down some blackberry bushes. I use a ladder or a plank or something, but they just need access. They can reach quite high, but sometimes they need a bit of help.
Yeah. Okay.
So I do quite a bit.
Yeah. What age do you start your goats in work and in weed eating?
So I want them to be, big enough to, or if they're really young, they seem to be more tempted to go under my fencing. Remember, my fencing is quite soft, so I like them to be at least 1.5 years, so that, you know, big enough to, that's not going to be so tempting to them. So I usually get mine when they're about 1.5 years.
Okay, okay. We have got quite a lot of questions, so I'm just going to pick a few more to finish off. And there's some useful information that people have put in there that I'm hoping that the audience have actually, you know, picking up on. What is this one's for you, Sandra. What is the maximum age for buckling to be banded, and are there any dangers of it being banded when it's 5 months old?
It varies in each state. In Queensland, you can't band over 3 months of age. That's an act of veterinary science. The Animal Welfare Code says 6 months, but I think that's too long, too old. There are dangers because tetanus is the main one, so you must make sure that the kids have had at least 2 vaccines protecting them for tetanus. Bear in mind that buck kids are fertile at 3 months of age, so their testicles are very large. And it's, in my opinion, poor welfare to band kids when they're over 3 months of age. They swell up, they smell, and they eventually go gangrenous and drop off. And that's not pleasant. And I'm sure it's not very pleasant for the kid.
Yeah.
So you should be doing that as soon as possible when they're, you know, a couple of weeks old, unless they're pet goats, when you get your vet to do it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. I'm not sure that we can answer this, but I'll throw it to you anyway. If you can't browse your goats, can you supplement them with branches of what types of trees?
Again, go to my Pinterest board, Safe Browse for Goats. There's a board that can look at what can be fed to goats safely.
Do you have a comment on that, Elisabeth?
No, I think it depends on where you live.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm in the far southeast of New South Wales, so I know what is suitable there, but I wouldn't be able to give general advice that way.
That's fine. Yeah. It's a very good point. Like, it's probably too broad an area for you to be able to.
What I can say is you've got to be very careful with garden ornamentals in general.
Right.
So avoid that if you can.
Yeah.
Because there are, you know, the rhododendron family is very toxic. You know, azalea, camellia, toxic, oleander. If there's any ornamentals that you don't know what it is, just don't do it. It is my general rule.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's a very good point. Okay.
Ask around. Ask goat owners in the area to find out whether or not what browse is safe. I think that's what I would do. Yeah.
So just be cautious until you actually know that it is safe for your goat to browse. Yeah. Okay. Just the last question to you, Sandra, and then I think we'll go to wrapping it up. What is the best way to feed Biowoma?
It has to be fed every day. So if you're feeding individual goats, you just put teaspoons in, mix it in the feed. If you're feeding a group, you might mix up a rubbish bin full, add up all the number of goats' weights, because it's 3 grams per 50 kilos, and then just add that into the feed before you mix it. Right. You can actually get it commercially mixed by a feed mill, so long as it's not pelleted. It has to be a mix. Yep. Right.
Okay. So I'd just like to thank people in the audience who've shared some ideas. There's a link there for AgriFutures, and a few there for the Victorian link as well. And I will put those links into the workshop, into the webinar summary, so that people can access them at some point in the future. And you can also tap into some of those resources that will that Sandra's mentioned, and also on our website that I'm just going to pop in the comments there now. So I'm just going to finish up now, just sharing my screen, and then I'll come back to you both. So just let you know that the Small Farms Network has a discussion group on Facebook that anyone can join, and you can share with us your stories about your small farm, and also find resources there to support each other. And that is open to anyone who would like to join. We will be placing this webinar on our YouTube channel, where we've got other webinar recordings, and also small videos that are relating to small farms. So please join us there on the YouTube channel. And just a little bit of a reminder about our website. You can go there, you can find a lot of free resources on topics that we've done in the past, including weeds, pasture management, soils, sheep and alpacas and pigs. There's a whole raft of resources there that you can link to. You can also find out about becoming a member of the Small Farms Network. Membership costs $22 for the financial year, and your membership helps us run events like this one and goes towards the administration of the association. Small Farms Network members receive benefits, including early alerts for upcoming workshops, members' newsletters, discounts for some events, and an opportunity to participate in special interest groups. You can also send us your notices relevant to small farmers to be advertised in the newsletter. Okay, so I'd also just ask you to, at the end of this webinar, if you can, just fill out the feedback form so that we can help, that helps us design future events. And also just to let you know that we will be having some more webinars coming up over winter, so you can keep in touch with us via the website and also the newsletter. All right, well, thank you so much. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a bit hoarse. So thank you for hanging in with us, Elisabeth and Sandra, and to all of our participants out there. It's been a really good webinar, and thanks so much for giving us your time today. And thanks, Elisabeth, for donating your time tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much.
Everyone.
See ya.
Good night.
Good night.